Grace Lawson didn't want a new body. She only wanted her marriage to feel whole again. 7 days after her surgery, she lay curled on her living room couch, whispering prayers through pain she wasn't prepared for. And the man she trusted, her husband, her pastor, stood nearby with a cup of tea he claimed would help her rest. She couldn't see the distance forming in his eyes. She couldn't feel the shift in his heart. All she knew was that love was supposed to stay, even when the body struggles. But tonight, the woman who gave everything was losing more than strength. She was losing time. Before we go any further, welcome to Crime Deck, where we uncover the stories too many people never see coming. Thank you to our loyal viewers and subscribers for always supporting our work. If our breakdowns keep you thinking long after the screen goes dark, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this story isn't just tragic, it's a reminder of how quiet suffering can take a life. Now, let's return to the beginning. Grace Lawson pushed her hand against the couch cushion, trying to steady herself as another wave of weakness hit her out of nowhere. Her breath caught short, sharp, shaky, and she blinked hard to clear her vision. The lamp beside her flickered across the quiet southern night, stretching her shadow across the wall. She wasn't healing. She wasn't resting. Something inside her body felt wrong. Across the room, Pastor Michael Lawson moved with a calm so controlled it almost didn't match the scene in front of him. He set a cup of tea on the table, adjusting it with slow, careful motions. His Bible lay open beside it, pages untouched. He didn't sit with her. He didn't rush toward her. He watched her from a few steps back, his expression unreadable. Grace tried to breathe through the pain. She tightened her jaw and forced a small, tired smile toward him, hoping he would come closer, hoping he would notice the fear swelling under her ribs. But he didn't move. He only asked, "You okay?" in a tone that felt more like a formality than concern. Her hand trembled as she reached for the tea. The cup rattled lightly against the saucer, and she hated that he heard it. She lifted it to her lips, her fingers slipping once before she caught herself. Warm liquid touched her tongue, but her stomach twisted the moment it went down. She whispered, "Something's wrong." He nodded, but nothing in his body reacted. No rush, no panic, no instinctive step toward the woman he claimed to love. Instead, he stood still, eyes fixed on her as if he were waiting for something. The house felt too quiet, too still, like it was holding its breath with her. Grace shifted again, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Her body folded slightly, her shoulder hitting the back of the couch. A soft sound escaped her throat, half groan, half plea. She tried to call his name, but the syllables caught halfway out. That's when he finally moved. He took 2 slow steps forward, watching her closely, studying her. Not with worry, not with urgency, with something she couldn't name. "Just rest," he said. "You need rest." The room hummed with tension. Even the night sounds outside seemed to fade, leaving only her uneven breathing and the faint clink of his ring tapping against the mug he had just placed beside her. Grace pressed her hand against her chest. Her heartbeat felt heavy and uneven. A thin layer of sweat gathered along her hairline. Her vision blurred again, edges softening, shapes doubling. She tried to sit up straighter, but her muscles refused to cooperate. "Michael," she whispered. He didn't answer. He reached for his phone. The sound of the emergency operator picking up cut through the silence. His voice changed instantly, shaking, urgent, desperate. Words tumbled out fast. "My wife. Please hurry. Something's happening." But Grace saw the way he paced. She heard what he didn't say. And even in her disoriented state, she felt a chill run through her. Paramedics burst through the door minutes later, rushing toward her as Michael gestured frantically toward the couch. Their faces tightened as they examined her. They exchanged quick, muted looks, trying to make sense of her symptoms, her breathing, the strange mix of weakness and confusion taking over her body. "What happened?" one of them asked. Michael answered quickly. Too quickly. "She just started fading," he said. "It must be her surgery. It must have gone wrong." They lifted Grace carefully, her body limp in their arms. The room filled with the static of radios, hurried instructions, the sound of boots on the floor. And as they carried her out, the question hangs in the doorway like smoke. How does a man go from promising to protect his wife to standing by as she falls apart right in front of him? But to understand how we got here, we have to go back to who Grace was before everything changed. To understand how Grace Lawson ended up fighting for her life on that couch, we have to go back to the world that shaped her long before she met Pastor Michael. Grace grew up in a small southern black community where people didn't measure worth by appearance or status. They measured it by kindness, by how quickly you showed up when someone needed help, by how gently you spoke to elders, by how you carried yourself when no one was watching. In her neighborhood, a good heart held more weight than a perfect figure ever could. Her mother, Miss Lorraine, taught her that lesson early. Lorraine wasn't a woman who wore flashy clothes or chased the newest trend. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her hands always busy with something sewing, stirring a pot, writing notes for church members who needed encouragement. When Grace stood in front of the mirror as a little girl and asked if she was pretty, Lorraine would wipe her hands, kneel down, and say, "Pretty fades, baby. But character? That's what lasts." Those words stayed with Grace. They shaped the way she viewed beauty, the way she viewed womanhood, the way she viewed herself. As Grace got older, the world around her shifted, but she stayed committed to those lessons. While other girls experimented with makeup or copied the latest styles they saw online, Grace stayed simple. Soft colors, neat hair, conservative dresses. She didn't feel pressure to compete because she never saw beauty as a competition. She saw it as something you lived from the inside out. But what she didn't realize was that this belief came with a quiet trap, a feeling that she always had to earn her place through service. Church life deepened that belief. Grace became the girl everyone could count on. If someone needed food after a funeral, she cooked. If an elderly member needed a ride, she drove. If a teenager was going through a crisis, Grace showed up at their door. People praised her dependability, called her a blessing, a true servant, the steady one. And she absorbed those words like sunlight. She didn't see the weight forming behind them, because being the dependable one also meant being the one no one checked on. Everyone leaned on Grace, but rarely did anyone ask what she needed. She learned to push down her own frustrations, her own exhaustion, her own fears, because she believed love was something you proved through sacrifice, and sacrifice became her default. There were moments, small ones, where this pattern showed itself clearly. Like the Saturday morning she spent ironing church linens alone, while everyone else decorated the sanctuary. She hummed to herself and worked quietly, not realizing she was training herself to accept a life where she carried loads that were never meant to be carried alone. Or the winter she coordinated the food drive, organizing donations, delivering meals, and comforting families without ever asking for help. Or the afternoon she sat with widows long after others left, listening to them cry while swallowing her own heartache from a breakup she never told anyone about. Grace didn't resent these moments. Serving made her feel needed. It made her feel valuable. But slowly, without her noticing, it also formed the belief that her worth depended on how much she gave. That as long as she stayed small and humble, she'd be loved. That love required endurance. That conflict was dangerous. These ideas lived deep within her, shaping every decision she made. And while the world around her began chasing new definitions of beauty, tiny waists, exaggerated curves, Instagram-ready bodies, Grace stayed rooted in what her mother taught her. She never envied that lifestyle. She saw it as vanity, a distraction, something that didn't belong to her world. She believed her value came from her heart, not her shape. But this quiet steadfastness, this devotion to humility, came with a fatal flaw. Grace tolerated emotional pain if it meant keeping the peace. She learned to shrink her needs, silence her discomfort, and smile through moments that hurt more than she admitted. She didn't know it yet, but this was the very wound that would later make her vulnerable to a man who preyed on that softness. Because long before she stepped into Michael Lawson's life, Grace already believed she had to earn love. But while Grace was learning humility, Michael was learning something very different. While Grace was growing up in a world shaped by humility and service, Michael Lawson was being raised in a home where the show mattered more than the truth. In his family, the image you projected carried more weight than who you were when the door closed. His father believed a man must always look like a leader, and he repeated that line so often Michael could recite it in his sleep. His mother matched that pressure, reminding him constantly, "People are watching. Don't embarrass this family." Their house didn't feel like a place to learn. It felt like a stage. From the time Michael learned to speak, he learned to perform. He learned how to stand tall, how to shake hands with just enough firmness, how to hold eye contact long enough to appear confident. His parents praised him only when others praised him first. If the church elders smiled at him, his father smiled too. If they didn't, Michael felt the shift instantly. That kind of childhood doesn't teach you emotional safety. It teaches you to chase approval like oxygen. The flaw that grew from that environment became clear early. Michael didn't pursue connection. He pursued admiration. He didn't crave closeness. He craved applause. He felt whole only when someone told him he looked sharp, sounded wise, or carried himself like a future pastor. Vulnerability had no place in his home. Real conversations were rare. Everything was presentation. And then adolescence came, bringing with it a discovery that clashed hard with the image his parents built for him. While his family expected discipline and restraint, he found himself drawn to a world his parents would never publicly acknowledge. Hyper-curvy women, extreme hourglass bodies, photos he shouldn't have been looking at. It wasn't simply attraction, it was the thrill of looking at something he knew he wasn't supposed to want. His computer screen lit up with images he would never admit to anyone, not because he was ashamed of desire, but because he was ashamed of how badly he wanted what his parents preached against. Those bodies, their shape, their intensity made him feel something he couldn't find in a sanctuary or a sermon. It planted a secret inside him, one that would follow him well into adulthood. And that secret shaped his blind spot. The belief that appearance makes a person valuable, that beauty earns attention, that outward perfection can cover inward emptiness. He convinced himself holiness and hypocrisy could coexist if he managed them well enough. As long as people saw a good man, he believed he was one. Over time, Michael became skilled at carrying two identities, one polished, one hidden. He learned how to walk into church with a Bible in his hand and a disciplined expression on his face, while his private longings lived just beneath the surface. The conflict wasn't visible to others, but it was sharp inside him. So when he met Grace years later, she stood out instantly. Her simplicity, her steadiness, the gentle way she carried herself, she felt like the safest place he'd ever known. She didn't demand a performance. She didn't expect perfection. She offered balance to a man who was constantly trying to hold together two different versions of himself. But that same steadiness also guaranteed conflict. Grace's humility confronted the part of him that craved applause. Her quiet confidence contradicted his hunger for attention, and her belief in inner beauty clashed with a desire he hoped no one would ever discover. What drew him to her was the same thing that would eventually make him resent her. There were signs even in his youth that he was more in love with the idea of being admired than the idea of loving someone. He would stand in the mirror, Bible in hand, practicing expressions he believed pastors were supposed to have, tilting his voice, adjusting his stance, rehearsing the path to becoming the kind of man people would follow. Long before anyone called him Pastor Lawson, he was already performing the role in his bedroom. That boy never learned how to tell the truth about himself, and that man never learned how to stop pretending. And when their worlds collided, it felt like destiny until it became destruction. Grace first saw Michael on a Sunday morning, much like any other sunlight cutting through stained glass windows, the choir warming up with soft harmonies, and the church alive with the kind of warmth only a close-knit Southern congregation can create. She was arranging programs at the back table, making sure every row had enough for the crowd. She moved with purpose, greeting people by name, smiling gently as she worked. Serving came naturally to her. Michael walked in as the guest preacher for the day, his presence pulling attention before he even reached the pulpit. He carried himself the way his parents raised him upright. Sure. Calculated in every step. The congregation welcomed him instantly. Compliments floated his way before he opened his Bible. Grace noticed how easily he accepted the praise, how comfortable he looked in front of admiration. Their eyes met briefly as she handed a program to an elderly woman. She glanced up, caught him watching her, and quickly looked away. She didn't think of herself as someone who caught attention, especially from a polished preacher. But there was something in the way he held her gaze, curiosity, mixed with a quiet kind of approval. During worship, Grace stood near the aisle, singing softly. Michael scanned the sanctuary, taking in the crowd, nodding at familiar faces and at women who seemed eager to catch his eye. Grace noticed the way his attention paused on a few curvier figures. A small discomfort tugged at her, but she pushed it aside. He was a man after all. And a guest preacher in a church full of emotion and admiration. She chose not to dwell on it. After service, Michael approached her as she collected offering envelopes. He thanked her for her help, complimented her kindness, said her calm spirit stood out in the room. She laughed lightly, unsure what to say. She wasn't used to praise aimed at her personally, especially from a man who seemed to live in the center of every social circle he stepped into. Their conversations grew from there slowly at first. He learned she volunteered almost every day of the week. She learned he moved between churches, speaking at revivals and youth conferences, building a reputation people admired. He liked that she listened to him without trying to impress him. She liked the confidence he carried so effortlessly. Prayer nights brought them closer. Sitting at the same table after meetings, they shared stories about their childhoods, their fears, their dreams. Grace spoke about wanting a peaceful home and a strong family. Michael talked about wanting to change lives through ministry. She admired his passion. He admired her steadiness, her willingness to give without asking for anything back. But even in these early moments, tension showed itself in small ways. When conversations about relationships came up, Michael often joked about modern women being too bold or too independent. Grace chuckled politely, unsure how to respond. He made comments about physical temptation, about how men struggled more now than in the past because everything is out there in plain sight. She nodded, choosing again to brush away the small discomfort. Their courtship unfolded with community dinners, late-night phone calls, and pastoral counseling sessions where Michael played the role he knew best, the admired leader. Grace found comfort in his certainty. He found validation in her devotion. In her, he felt anchored. In him, she saw direction. Her wound-believing love required service fit too neatly with his flaw, needing admiration to feel whole. She catered to him with quiet gestures, packing meals, supporting his engagements, praying for him before sermons. Michael absorbed her care like it was expected. When he proposed, the church celebrated with cheers and applause. The wedding day felt like a blessing. Grace glowing with hope, Michael shining under the attention. But even in their vows, there was an imbalance. He stood proudly at the center. She stood beside him, steady and supportive. Neither of them realized how fragile that balance truly was. But even the purest beginnings can rot from the inside. Before we continue, take a moment to join this community. Hit the notification bell, subscribe to Crime Deck, and share this video so more people can follow this journey. And here's a question to sit with as we move forward. Have you ever ignored a small red flag because you believed love needed patience? The shift in Michael didn't happen overnight. It showed up in quiet behaviors Grace tried to overlook. One of the earliest signs came from the way he scrolled through social media. He claimed he was studying youth trends for sermons. But Grace would walk past his screen and notice his feed filled with the same type of women. Instagram influencers with tiny waists, exaggerated hips, and the signature shape of cosmetic surgery he admired far more than he admitted. He lingered on their photos too long, saved posts he thought she wouldn't see. He made casual comments about how times have changed and how modern curves are something else. Grace laughed nervously, brushing it off, but inside, something wilted. She had never lived in that world. She didn't want to. Yet she saw how deeply it pulled at him. And then came the woman who would change everything. Michael met her during a revival in a nearby city, a weekend meant for prayer and fellowship. Grace didn't travel with him that time. She stayed home to help the church food pantry. While she stocked shelves and prayed with families, Michael found himself surrounded by admirers who treated him like a celebrity. One of them was a woman with the exact body type he obsessed over online. A dramatic hourglass shape, enhanced curves, confidence that filled the room. She wasn't shy with him. She complimented his preaching, stood too close, asked for personal prayer after service. Michael didn't pull away. That weekend turned into messages. Messages turned into video calls. And eventually, messages turned into something far more intimate. Grace first sensed the affair before she had proof. It was in the withdrawals, the fragrances on his shirts, the way he guarded his phone like it held the church building itself. But the confirmation came harshly. One night, while cleaning the dining table, Grace picked up his phone to move it, and a text lit up the screen. "You still haven't sent the rest. I told you I'm late." Her heart punched into her throat. She opened the thread and read everything she never wanted to see: photos, conversations, demands for hush money, and confirmation that the mistress, a woman shaped exactly like the Instagram figures he worshipped, was pregnant with his child. Grace confronted him with tears streaming down her face, shaking so hard she could barely speak. She expected denial. But Michael didn't deny anything. He collapsed into a chair, holding his head, breathing like the house was closing in. Then he launched into a sermon-like confession, claiming he'd been under attack, claiming temptation found him at his lowest, claiming the devil sent that woman to destroy him. He wrapped his wrongdoing in scripture and desperation. "Grace, please. I messed up. I'm under spiritual warfare. I need you. Don't give up on me." Grace stood there, devastated. Betrayal wasn't just a broken vow, it was the realization that the man she trusted with her entire life had crossed lines she never imagined he'd cross. But even in her heartbreak, she didn't shout. She didn't leave. She cradled her pain quietly, the way she'd been conditioned since childhood. Michael promised change. He cried into her hands. He vowed to cut all ties, to be transparent, to rebuild. Grace believed him not because he deserved it, but because she believed marriage meant endurance. She wanted to believe the man she married still existed under the man standing before her. But forgiveness didn't stop the cracks. It only gave him more room to hide them. And that night, after Grace finally fell asleep, Michael stared at the ceiling, thinking more about the mess he needed to manage than the woman he had just broken. Grace didn't reach her breaking point through rage or accusation. She reached it through sorrow, through the kind of quiet self-blame that grows in women who think love can be saved if they just try a little harder. After weeks of noticing changes in Michael's behavior, she didn't want to assume the worst. She didn't want to believe she wasn't enough. She just wanted clarity because communication, she'd always been taught, was the foundation of a healthy marriage. So that night, as she folded laundry in their bedroom, she replayed the advice older married women had given her. Talk to your husband. Don't hold things inside. Grace believed in that. She believed in approaching problems with softness instead of confrontation. And she believed deeply that if she could just reach the honest part of Michael, the man she married would still be there. She wiped her eyes, steadied her breath, and walked into the living room where he sat scrolling on his phone. Not to argue, not to accuse, but to open a door she hoped he would walk through. She sat beside him, knees trembling, and gently said, "Michael, I need to ask something. I'm asking because I want us to be stronger." He looked up briefly, surprised by her tone. She swallowed hard, searching for courage she didn't feel. "What would make you stop cheating?" She expected a denial, a quick reassurance, a promise that she misunderstood. But instead, Michael leaned back, rubbed his face, and sighed heavily, as though the truth inconvenienced him. And then came the sentence that would carve into her heart. "If you look like them, I wouldn't need anyone else." Them. The women online. The women he flirted with. The woman who carried his child. Those words didn't hit her like a slap. They hit her like a collapse from the inside. Her first instinct wasn't anger, it was shame. Deep, bone-level shame. A sadness that told her she had failed him somehow. She thought back to her mother's lessons about modesty and character. She thought of how she never cared for glamorous looks or dramatic curves. And in one moment, all of that felt like a burden instead of a virtue. Grace returned to the bedroom quietly, sat at the edge of the mattress, pressed her palm to her chest, and tried to steady the hurt. She didn't cry right away. She simply asked God to show her how to fix what she believed she had broken. She wrestled with her faith, her identity, her fear of becoming the pastor's wife whose marriage fell apart in front of the whole congregation. If changing herself would bring healing, wasn't that worth it? Hours later, after prayer and heartbreak, Grace made a decision. Not because she wanted a new body, but because she wanted a restored marriage. She walked back to Michael, voice trembling, and said, "I'll do it, if it will help us." That sparked something in him too bright, too eager. His posture straightened, his eyes lit up. Suddenly he was making plans, talking about renewal, about rebuilding, about how this choice would reignite connection. He wrapped his excitement in spiritual language, turning a cosmetic surgery into a covenant step. He became overly involved, instantly choosing an out-of-state clinic to keep members from gossiping, researching financing options, scheduling consultations. Grace followed his lead, hoping obedience would close the distance between them. On surgery day, the clinic felt colder than she expected. Sterile lights, the hum of machines, nurses moving quickly. As she lay on the operating table, she whispered a small prayer. "Please let this fix my home." Then the anesthesia took her. Hours later, she woke up in a recovery bed, her throat dry, her body aching deeper than she imagined. She tried to shift, but pain spread across her hips like a warning. A nurse told her everything went smoothly, but Grace's face tightened, her breath hitched, and fear crept into her chest. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. The first few days after her discharge from the hospital were rough, but no one from the church suspected anything. Grace had slipped out of town quietly. Michael told members she was visiting a cousin, and Grace kept her phone off to avoid questions. No one knew she had gone for surgery, and certainly not the kind that would change everything about her body and her life. But once she got home, recovery hit her harder than she imagined. What she assumed would be normal soreness sharpened into something deeper. Heat gathered under her skin, swelling pushed against her clothes, and the drainage, thick, discolored, seemed to worsen by the hour. Grace tried to push through it, reminding herself that healing takes time. Then came the smell. A faint, sour odor she didn't want to acknowledge. She froze the moment she noticed it, praying it came from anything other than her own body. She showered quickly, scrubbing her skin until it stung. But when she stepped out, the smell remained. For 2 days, she kept it to herself, terrified of what it meant. Then one evening, Michael found her sitting on the edge of the bed, shaking. His face tightened not with concern, but with discomfort. "What's going on, Grace?" he asked, stepping back slightly. She swallowed hard, knowing she couldn't hide it forever. "The clinic called," she whispered. They said there was a complication. Something with the fat not settling right. It might smell, and it might leak for a while." Her voice cracked on the last word. She felt ashamed of her own body, ashamed that she had tried to fix herself for him and gotten broken in the process. Michael didn't comfort her. He didn't ask for details. He didn't sit beside her. His face shifted with something between disgust and annoyance. "Grace, this is bad," he muttered, stepping farther away. That reaction crushed her. She wrapped her arms around her stomach and lowered her head as if apologizing for existing. While she battled fear, Michael battled something else entirely. Panic about his reputation. He couldn't have people smelling his wife at church. He couldn't have members whispering. He couldn't risk anyone learning she had gotten plastic surgery because he pressured her into it. And from there, the downward spiral only grew sharper. Michael watched Grace grow weaker with each passing day, and instead of concern, something darker settled into him. Something fueled by fear, ego, and the weight of secrets pressing on his neck. The smell in the house was no longer faint. The mistress was demanding more money, threatening to expose everything. And at church, members whispered about why Grace hadn't returned home yet. Every question, every rumor, every phone call tightened the pressure around him. He felt trapped between 3 worlds. The mistress who refused to disappear, the ministry he worshipped more than God, and the wife whose suffering had become an inconvenience. And Michael was a man who didn't know how to tell the truth. He only knew how to survive by shaping a version of himself people admired. Now that image, the one he guarded his entire life, was slipping through his fingers. One night, after Grace fell asleep, he sat at his desk with the lights off, the only glow coming from his laptop screen. His fingers hovered uncertainly at first. Then he began typing with a kind of cold determination. Poison that looks like infection. Toxins that mimic sepsis symptoms. How long after ingestion does confusion start? The search bar filled with questions no pastor should ever ask. He scrolled through articles, medical forums, and household product breakdowns. Clicked links about cleaning agents. Read warnings about substances found under kitchen sinks. Saved screenshots. His face, illuminated only by the blue glow of the screen, looked unfamiliar, hard, focused, calculating. When he realized certain chemicals could be purchased without raising suspicion, his breathing steadied. He opened tabs for online suppliers, added items to carts, cleared the history, reopened the tabs through private browsing. He moved with the caution of a man who has something to lose and something to hide. Meanwhile, Grace, asleep in the next room, shifted in pain. Her body ached. Her bandages were damp again. She whispered his name in her sleep, a fragile sound, hopeful in the dark. She still believed reconciliation was possible, still believed the surgery had meaning, still believed Michael loved her. She didn't see the danger forming around her. Michael justified each step as if reading from his own twisted scripture. God removes obstacles, he whispered to himself. I am his servant. I am protecting the ministry he gave me. He said it like a confirmation, like a vow he was convincing himself to keep. The next evening, he rehearsed his performance carefully. He stood in front of the bedroom mirror with his phone pressed to his ear, practicing how his voice would shake when he called 911, how he would gasp between words, how he would describe her symptoms. He shifted his tone from panic to heartbreak to righteous sorrow, like a pastor grieving his wife, not a man planning her death. He practiced everything. The pause before mentioning her surgery, the catch in his voice when saying her name, the prayer he would whisper loudly enough for dispatch to hear. Then he smiled faintly, proud of the persona he knew the world would believe. 7 days after she came home from the hospital, he made his decision. In Scripture, 7 often meant completion. To Michael, that number felt symbolic, poetic even, a clean ending to a messy situation. He walked into the kitchen, moved slowly, deliberately, opening cabinets and collecting what he needed. He set a mug on the counter, watching it for a long moment as though imagining the future he believed he was securing. Grace lay weakly on the couch, her breathing uneven. She didn't question why he was suddenly gentle with her again. She wanted to believe the man she married had come back. Michael stirred the tea with steady hands. His humming drifted softly through the room, a worship song about redemption, about deliverance, his voice calm, purposeful, almost peaceful. Nothing could stop what would happen next. And before we step into the moment that changed everything, take a second to stay connected with us. Hit the notification bell, subscribe to Crime Deck, and share this story so others can walk this journey with us. Here's something to think about as we continue. When does protecting someone's reputation become more dangerous than protecting their life? Grace was already exhausted when Michael placed the warm mug in her hands. He didn't explain anything this time, didn't force reassurance or pretend tenderness. He simply told her, drink a little. It'll help you sleep. She trusted him because she wanted to. She trusted him because she needed something to hold on to after so much fear and humiliation. And she trusted him because after everything, she still believed marriages could heal. The first sip eased the dryness in her throat. The second calmed the ache in her stomach. By the third, her shoulders loosened as if the tension she'd carried for days was finally slipping away. She closed her eyes briefly, grateful for one small moment of relief. Thank you, she whispered, barely audible. But the comfort didn't last. Minutes later, Grace tried to adjust her position on the couch, and her arm didn't respond the way it should. Her hand slipped awkwardly off the blanket. She blinked, confused. Her breathing tightened, turning shallow and uneven. A dull pressure wrapped around her chest, not sharp, not panicked, just heavy enough to feel wrong. Michael? She tried again, her voice thin, almost childlike. He stepped closer but stopped just short of touching her. His face remained unreadable as if he were observing something he had already accepted. Grace lifted her eyes toward him, searching for fear, concern, anything familiar. But all she found was distance. Her head grew light. The room tilted gently. She tried to sit forward, but her body no longer cooperated. Her fingers curled involuntarily, as though they were shrinking away from her own commands. She attempted to call his name again, but only air came out, no sound, no strength. Her vision blurred at the edges, colors smearing into one another. She blinked rapidly, desperate to stay awake, desperate to stay alive, desperate to give her marriage one more chance. Her lips parted as if to plead, but her voice failed her. Her final exhale trembled out of her, soft and uneven. Then stillness. Michael lowered himself onto the arm of the couch, watching her chest. He waited not for help, not for clarity, just waited until the rise and fall stopped completely. Only then did he pull his phone from his pocket. His voice cracked on command the moment the 911 operator answered. "My wife, she's not breathing. Something's wrong, please hurry." The tremble in his voice could have fooled anyone. The rush of breath between his words, the way he kept saying her name, like a grieving husband, desperate for a miracle. He performed it perfectly. Paramedics arrived quickly, stepping into a living room heavy with the smell of antiseptic, damp bandages, and something else none of them could immediately name. They worked over Grace's body and practiced motions, checking vitals, lifting eyelids, searching for signs of revival. But her symptoms confused them. The stiffening limbs, the discoloration, the shallow residue near her lips. Combined with her recent surgery, it mimicked something rare, an unexpected complication they had heard of only in unusual BBL cases. They exchanged puzzled looks but proceeded with protocol. Michael sat nearby, head buried in his hands, playing the part everyone expected of a widowed preacher. When the lead paramedic finally shook his head, signaling the end, Michael let out a long, trembling breath. Word spread through the church before sunrise. Members flooded his phone with prayers and condolences. Sisters from the women's ministry cooked meals. Church elders arrived at his doorstep, embracing him, calling him strong, calling him faithful, calling him a man standing in the fire. They believed every tear he wiped away. But inside Grace's body, the truth waited, and secrets have a way of leaking. Just like the truth inside her, Grace's death was recorded as a possible surgical complication, but the report didn't settle well with the county medical examiner. Something about her body told a different story, something her surgery alone couldn't explain. And as soon as that doubt landed on paper, detectives began asking questions. The first interview was with the woman who had been draining Michael's bank account, the mistress. She didn't break down or deny anything. She smirked through the meeting, arms folded, eyes sharp. "I told him it wasn't my problem," she said. "He kept whining about how he couldn't stand the smell in that house, said she was making everything fall apart." Those words changed the direction of the investigation instantly. If Michael was disgusted by Grace's condition, why didn't he take her to a hospital? Why didn't he ask anyone for help? Detectives subpoenaed his electronic records next, and when they opened his search history, the screen became a confession in itself. Late-night searches, private browser windows, key phrases that made the investigators freeze. Poison that mimics infection. How long does sepsis take to kill? BBL, fat necrosis smell treatment. Toxins that don't show in blood tests. Each query painted a clearer picture than any witness could. This wasn't a grieving husband researching complications. This was preparation. Then came the financial records. Withdrawals lining up perfectly with the mistress's threats. Each payment more frantic than the last. Each one matched to text messages she had saved, messages where Michael begged her not to expose him, not to contact the church, not to tell Grace the full truth. The forensic pathology report delivered the final blow. It showed inconsistencies, chemical markers that didn't align with surgical complications. Her organs carried traces of substances that should never have been inside her body, and the timeline of her decline didn't match a normal post-op infection. What happened to Grace was introduced intentionally. With all of this, the case moved quickly to trial. Courtroom seats filled every day. Church members packed the benches, some wearing buttons with Grace's picture, others still clinging to the idea that their pastor was innocent. Michael entered in a suit, holding a Bible, eyes downcast, rehearsing humility the same way he rehearsed his sermons. The prosecution laid out the story piece by piece, motive, rooted in ego, opportunity created by secrecy, and actions fueled by fear of exposure. They played the 911 call in court, letting the jury hear the crafted panic in Michael's voice. They showed the timeline of his searches. They called experts to explain the toxins found in Grace's system. The defense argued that Michael was overwhelmed, that he panicked because his wife was dying, that grief made him sound frantic and confused. They tried to frame the death as a tragic medical outcome. But then came the witnesses. Grace's closest friend testified that Grace hid her symptoms because she didn't want to shame Michael. A nurse from the clinic described how Grace insisted she was fine despite clear signs of distress. The courtroom learned that Grace protected her husband until her final days, believing her pain was her own burden to carry. The jury listened, watched, took in every detail. And when the prosecution connected the pattern, the mistress, the money, the searches, the chemicals, the timing, the truth no longer shook. It stood firm. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Michael's legs buckled as the courtroom gasped. Church members cried. Others looked away, unable to reconcile the man they admired with the truth laid bare. Grace finally had justice. But justice doesn't bring someone back. It only exposes what was already broken. The verdict landed like a shockwave through the congregation. The same people who once cheered for Pastor Michael now sat in their homes with their heads in their hands, replaying years of sermons, wondering how they missed the cracks forming behind his polished smile. The church didn't collapse overnight, but the trust inside it did. Members whispered in hallways, avoided eye contact in parking lots, and questioned whether they had unknowingly worshipped charisma instead of truth. Some defended him, still clinging to the version of Michael they wanted to believe in. Others felt betrayed, embarrassed that they'd mistaken control for leadership. For the first time in years, Sunday service felt heavy. The pulpit stood empty, and the choir's voices trembled without Grace's gentle guidance. Her absence echoed louder than any sermon ever had. Grace's family carried a different burden, the grief of losing a woman who spent her life holding others together while slowly unraveling herself. Her mother sat in a quiet living room surrounded by casseroles and sympathy cards, staring at a framed picture of Grace as a little girl, hair in braids, smiling shyly at the camera. She wondered how her daughter's heart could stay soft in a world that demanded so much from her. She wondered why Grace never felt safe enough to say she was hurting. Her siblings sorted through Grace's belongings with shaking hands. They found notebooks with prayer requests for other people, grocery lists written in her neat handwriting, and her choir robe pressed perfectly, hanging untouched. They held it close, imagining the warmth Grace once carried inside it. Michael, meanwhile, sat several counties away in a concrete cell that didn't care about his reputation. No applause, no lights, no congregation waiting for his voice, just a narrow bunk, the sound of metal doors clanging shut, and the silence of a man alone with the truth he fought so hard to hide. For the first time, he couldn't perform his way out of consequences. His reflection in the small, scratched mirror showed him exactly who he had become. The community felt the weight of Grace's story too. Women who once admired her quiet strength began rethinking their own expectations, how much they gave, how much they forgave, how often they carried emotional loads without asking for help. Conversations started in beauty salons, grocery lines, and Bible study groups. They talked about Grace's silent suffering, about the pressure placed on wives to endure instead of speak, about the way people overlook gentle women until it's too late. And slowly, her story changed something in them. Mothers told their daughters that love should not demand silence. Friends checked on each other more intentionally. Women recognized pieces of themselves in Grace's sacrifices and promised not to disappear inside someone else's expectations. The choir kept her robe on a chair the first Sunday after the trial. No one touched it. No one dared to move it. It sat there like a reminder of a heart that once served everyone but herself. Her prayer circle, where she once held hands and whispered comfort into tired ears, had an empty seat that stayed open, untouched, week after week. Some cried when they saw it. Others smiled softly, remembering her warmth. Near the end of that winter, Grace's mother walked alone to the cemetery. She wore a heavy coat, her hands tucked deep into her sleeves. She kneeled beside the stone, carved with her daughter's name. Simple, gentle, like Grace herself. The wind moved lightly through the grass as she placed her palm on the cold granite. "You were enough," she whispered, voice trembling but sure. The breeze carried her words across the quiet yard, settling them into the earth Grace now rested in. But what does a story like this say about us? About what we demand from women? In the end, the story of Grace Lawson returns us to the same paradox we opened, with how a marriage built on vows of love became a weapon, how a man trusted by a congregation used image as armor, and how a woman who gave everything slowly disappeared inside someone else's expectations. Grace didn't walk into danger because she was naive. She walked into it because she believed love could be repaired if she carried enough of the weight. She believed humble hearts could fix proud ones. She believed faith could quiet fear. But the truth is harsher. Love alone cannot save someone who worships their own reflection. Michael didn't kill Grace in a moment of rage. He killed her through a series of choices rooted in ego, shame, and desperation, to protect an identity he valued more than the woman who shared his home. Grace's surgery didn't set her death in motion. His pride did. His infidelity did. His fear of exposure did. And when confronted with the consequences of his own actions, he chose silence over honesty, reputation over redemption, and himself over her. That is the deeper tragedy. Because somewhere out there, beyond the news headlines, beyond the courtroom transcripts, beyond the timeline of events, the real story sits quietly in the spaces we often overlook. It sits in the moment Grace tugged at her dress in the mirror, wondering why she suddenly wasn't enough. It sits in the exhaustion she carried home from church, believing service was the way to hold her marriage together. It sits in the prayers she whispered through pain, hoping her suffering had purpose. The cost women pay when men worship ego over truth is far greater than we acknowledge. Many carry the weight silently, believing patience is strength, endurance is loyalty, sacrifice is love. And when their pain finally surfaces, when the truth comes out, it's always followed by the same haunting question. How many Graces are suffering quietly today? How many women lower their voices, adjust their bodies, shrink their dreams, or hide their wounds to keep someone else comfortable? How often do we mistake manipulation for devotion simply because it arrives wrapped in scripture, charm, or authority? How often do communities look away because the truth would force them to confront the idols they've built around certain men? These questions don't belong only to Grace's story. They belong to all of us. Because what happened to her isn't just a crime, it's a reflection, a mirror held up to the expectations placed on women, the pressure to endure, the demand to be forgiving even when forgiveness is weaponized against them. It's a warning about what happens when image becomes an idol and vulnerability becomes a weakness exploited by those who should protect it. Grace didn't die from a surgery gone wrong. She died from someone else's shame. She died because her compassion outweighed her boundaries. She died because the world applauded a man's charisma and ignored a woman's quiet suffering. And now, her story asks something of us. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe unseen women deserve to be heard, if you believe communities should protect the vulnerable instead of the powerful, if you believe awareness can save someone else's life, then let your voice join ours. Like, share, and subscribe to Crime Deck. Not for numbers, not for clicks, but because every person who hears Grace's story becomes one more voice against silence, one more reason another woman might speak up, one more reminder that awareness is the first step toward change. This story closes here, but the questions it raises remain, and they ask us, quietly but firmly, what will we do with them?